The observation lounge of the Concordia stretched out like a cathedral made of stars and steel, its transparent aluminum dome offering an unobstructed view of the Kepler nebula's swirling pink and gold clouds. Princess Lyralii of the Zephyrian Empire had claimed the same corner table for the past 3 weeks, positioning herself where the ambient lighting cast the most flattering shadows across her elongated ears, a habit she developed after noticing how humans tended to stare at them with expressions ranging from scientific curiosity to barely concealed revulsion. She pressed her fingertips against the cool surface of her quantum tablet, scrolling through the morning's diplomatic briefings with the enthusiasm of someone reading their own autopsy report. Another trade dispute between the outer colonies. Another, cultural misunderstanding, that had resulted in a Zephyrian merchant being ejected from a human space station for the apparently offensive act of existing while having pointed ears. Another carefully worded statement from the High Council expressing their deep concern about deteriorating relations, which in diplomatic speak meant they were about as concerned as a black hole was about stellar property values. The irony wasn't lost on her that she sat in the crown jewel of interspecies cooperation, a station jointly designed and built by human and Zephyrian engineers, yet she might as well have been sitting in a containment field for all the social interactions she received. The Concordia housed 3,000 souls from both species, and somehow she'd managed to become the loneliest person in a 50 light-year radius. A group of human astrophysicists entered the lounge, their conversation animated until they spotted her. The discussion died as if someone had activated a sound dampener, and they performed what she'd come to think of as the human shuffle, that peculiar sideways migration that took them as far from her table as the room's geometry would allow. Dr. Harrison, the lead researcher, offered a polite nod that contained roughly the same warmth as deep space before steering his colleagues toward the opposite end of the lounge. Lyralii returned to her tablet, pulling up the latest intelligence reports about the terrorist attacks that had been plaguing both human and Zephyrian space. 3 coordinated strikes in the past month, each one expertly designed to maximize casualties and political fallout. The pattern was troubling, too sophisticated for random extremists, too precisely timed to be coincidental. Someone was playing a very dangerous game of interstellar chess, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that she was being positioned as an expendable pawn. The lounge's environmental systems hummed quietly, maintaining the delicate atmospheric balance required for both species. Humans needed slightly more oxygen, while Zephyrians preferred a touch more nitrogen, so the Concordia split the difference and left everyone feeling slightly lightheaded. It was, she reflected, a perfect metaphor for the entire peace treaty, a compromise that satisfied no one but kept everyone breathing. Her pointed ears twitched involuntarily as the lounge doors hissed open again. More humans, no doubt, come to admire the view and practice their avoidance techniques. She'd started rating their performances in her head. The astrophysicists had managed a solid 7 out of 10, smooth execution, minimal obvious discomfort, excellent use of furniture as barriers. The engineering team yesterday had scored only a 4, with one junior technician actually backing into a serving droid in his haste to maintain distance. But the footsteps approaching her section of the lounge didn't veer away. They maintained a steady rhythm across the polished deck plating, accompanied by the subtle whir of a magnetic tool belt and the soft squeak of worn work boots. Lyralii glanced up from her tablet to see a human male in engineering coveralls, his dark hair disheveled and a streak of what looked like quantum lubricant across his left cheek. He surveyed the lounge with the methodical gaze of someone assessing a technical problem, taking in the scattered seating arrangements and the carefully maintained buffer zones around her table. Without ceremony, fanfare, or any apparent awareness that he was violating about 17 unwritten rules of interspecies etiquette, he walked directly to the chair beside her and sat down. Lyralii blinked, certain she was experiencing some form of atmospheric hallucination. Humans didn't sit next to her. They certainly didn't do it with the casual indifference of someone selecting a wrench from a toolbox. Yet here he was, settling into the cushioned chair with a satisfied grunt and turning his attention to the nebula beyond the dome as if sharing a table with an alien princess was the most natural thing in the galaxy. The engineer, his name tag read, Morrison, J., pulled out a battered personal tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be maintenance schedules. His presence radiated the kind of practical competence that came from years of fixing things that weren't supposed to break, combined with the philosophical acceptance that they would break anyway. There was something almost meditative about his calm efficiency, as if the universe's tendency toward entropy was simply another engineering challenge to be solved with the right tools and sufficient caffeine. Interesting gravitational lensing effect through the nebula's outer shell, he said without looking up from his tablet, his voice carrying the slight hoarseness of someone who'd spent too many hours breathing recycled air in maintenance shafts. The quantum field distortions are creating some beautiful light patterns. Lyralii stared at him, her diplomatic training warring with complete bewilderment. In 3 weeks of occupying this table, no one had spoken to her except to request she move to a different section or to inform her that her beverage choice violated some obscure human custom. And now this grease-stained engineer was making casual conversation about astrophysics as if they were old colleagues sharing a lunch break. "You're not afraid I might be planning to steal state secrets or perform some elaborate alien mind control technique?" she asked, curiosity overriding caution. Morrison finally looked at her, his brown eyes showing mild confusion rather than the wariness she'd grown accustomed to. "Are you?" "Not at the moment, no." "Then I think we're probably fine." He returned his attention to the nebula, pointing at a particularly bright spiral of ionized gas. "See that formation? The magnetic field interactions are creating a natural particle accelerator. We could probably power half the station just by tapping into that energy differential." Despite herself, Lyralii found her scientific background asserting itself. The quantum resonance frequency would be impossible to stabilize at this distance. You'd need to position collection arrays within the nebula itself, and the radiation levels would fry any known shielding within hours. Exactly why it's just a pretty light show instead of a practical power source. Morrison's tablet chimed softly, and he grimaced at whatever message had appeared. "Though at this point, I'd risk the radiation exposure if it meant I didn't have to recalibrate the antimatter containment systems again." Whoever designed the magnetic bottle configurations apparently never heard of redundant safety protocols. The casual way he discussed potentially catastrophic containment failures while sitting in a chair that cost more than most people's annual salary struck Lyralii as quintessentially human. They built magnificent things and then complained about the engineering shortcuts that made them possible, all while drinking beverages that were technically classified as mild toxins by Zephyrian health standards. The quantum resonance alarm had been shrieking for exactly 17 minutes when James Morrison finally acknowledged that pretending it would stop on its own wasn't a viable engineering strategy. He rolled out of his narrow bunk in the engineer's quarters, his feet hitting the cold deck plating with the resigned thud of someone who'd learned that the universe had a personal vendetta against his sleep schedule. The alarm's pitch suggested a containment field fluctuation in the antimatter storage bay, not immediately fatal, but the kind of problem that would become spectacularly catastrophic if left unattended. Like most things on the Concordia, it was designed by committee, which meant it combined the worst aspects of both human and Zephyrian engineering philosophies. Humans built things to be robust and reparable. Zephyrians built things to be elegant and efficient. The result was a station that looked magnificent and worked about as reliably as a weather prediction algorithm. James stumbled into his coveralls, grabbed his tool kit, and made his way through the station's labyrinthine corridors toward the storage bay. The Concordia operated on a 26-hour cycle, a compromise between human and Zephyrian circadian rhythms that left everyone feeling slightly jet-lagged for eternity. It was, he reflected, typical of diplomatic solutions: find the middle ground between two perfectly reasonable positions and create something that annoyed everyone equally. The storage bay doors hissed open to reveal Princess Lyralii standing before the main containment unit, her elongated ears practically vibrating with concentration as she manipulated a holographic display of quantum field equations. She'd traded her formal diplomatic attire for a practical lab coat that was 3 sizes too large, giving her the appearance of a graduate student who'd wandered into the wrong department and decided to fix everything anyway. "Please tell me you're not attempting to recalibrate an antimatter containment field using theoretical calculations," James said, setting down his tool kit with a metallic clatter that echoed through the bay. "I'm attempting to prevent us from becoming a very brief but spectacular addition to the local space debris," Lyralii replied without looking away from the display. Your containment field is oscillating at precisely the wrong frequency to maintain stable magnetic bottle integrity. We have perhaps 20 minutes before the antimatter decides to become matter in a very energetic fashion. James moved to the auxiliary control panel, his fingers dancing across the manual override controls with the practiced efficiency of someone who performed this particular dance too many times. And you know this because you happen to be an expert in human antimatter containment technology. I know this because quantum mechanics doesn't care about your species' aesthetic preferences. The same mathematical principles that govern Zephyrian power systems apply to your magnetic bottles, even if your implementation looks like it was designed by someone who thought redundancy was a suggestion rather than a requirement. The containment field stabilized with a harmonious hum that suggested the universe had decided to postpone their collective disintegration for another day. James wiped his hands on his coveralls, noting that Lyraliai's theoretical approach had solved in 10 minutes what would have taken him an hour of methodical troubleshooting. It was either impressive or deeply annoying, and he hadn't decided which. Your people's reputation for theoretical brilliance is apparently well-deserved, he said, checking the secondary containment readings to confirm the field was holding steady. Your people's reputation for practical engineering is also accurate, though your coffee-making technology remains completely mystifying. Lyraliai gestured toward the beverage dispenser mounted near the control station. I've been observing humans consume this liquid for weeks, and I cannot determine whether it's a nutritional supplement, a recreational drug, or some form of religious ritual. James activated the dispenser, producing 2 cups of what the station cafeteria optimistically labeled coffee but which bore only a passing resemblance to anything grown on Earth. It's all 3, depending on the shift schedule and how many consecutive hours you've been preventing antimatter explosions. Lyraliai accepted the cup with the cautious expression of someone handling potentially hazardous materials. She took a tentative sip, and her pointed ears immediately flattened against her head in what James was learning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of wincing. This tastes like industrial lubricant mixed with regret. That's actually a pretty accurate description of station coffee. The real stuff doesn't survive the preservation process required for long-term space storage, so we're left with synthetic approximations that capture the essential bitterness while eliminating anything resembling flavor. James took a long drink from his own cup, his expression suggesting he'd made peace with culinary disappointment years ago. Though I notice you're still drinking it. The caffeine provides interesting neurochemical effects. Zephyrian physiology processes stimulants differently than humans. Instead of increased alertness, we experience something closer to euphoric mathematical clarity. Your coffee essentially functions as a recreational drug that makes quantum equations more entertaining. The storage bay's communication panel crackled to life, broadcasting the morning station-wide announcements in a carefully neutral tone of automated systems. Trade negotiations between the Centauri colonies and the Zephyrian outer provinces had stalled again over tariff disputes. A human merchant vessel had reported harassment by Zephyrian patrol ships near the neutral zone. 3 more terrorist attacks had occurred in the past 48 hours, 2 on human installations, 1 on a Zephyrian research facility. The pattern suggests coordination, Lyraliai said, her earlier levity fading as the reports continued. These aren't random acts of violence. Someone is systematically targeting locations that represent cooperation between our species. James pulled up the incident reports on his tablet, studying the data with the methodical approach he usually reserved for technical problems. The timing is too precise. Each attack occurs exactly 72 hours after increased diplomatic activity. It's like someone has access to our negotiation schedules and is using them to plan their operations. Which implies infiltration at the highest levels of both governments. Lyraliai's ears twitched nervously, a gesture James was beginning to recognize as her equivalent of running calculations in her head. The only people with access to that level of coordination would be people like you, James finished quietly. The accusation hung in the recycled air between them like an unexploded ordnance. Lyraliai's expression shifted through surprise, hurt, and finally a resigned understanding that cut deeper than anger. Yes. People exactly like me. Royal family members with diplomatic immunity and unrestricted access to both human and Zephyrian facilities. The perfect suspects for anyone looking to assign blame. I didn't mean. Yes, you did. And you're absolutely correct to be suspicious. Lyralii set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, as if the simple action required all her concentration. I have access to classified information from both sides. I've been present at every major diplomatic session in the past 6 months, and my own people consider me a political liability who's too friendly with humans. If I were investigating these attacks, I would certainly want to question someone matching my profile. James found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his logical analysis collide with his growing respect for someone who could both solve quantum mechanics problems and make self-deprecating jokes about being framed for terrorism. The difference is that if you were coordinating terrorist attacks, you probably wouldn't have bothered preventing our antimatter containment system from converting us into cosmic radiation. Unless preventing the explosion was part of an elaborate plan to gain your trust before betraying you in a dramatically ironic fashion. Lyralii's mouth quirked upward in what might have been a smile if it hadn't been edged with genuine concern. Though I should point out that anyone capable of that level of strategic thinking probably wouldn't have gotten caught drinking coffee that tastes like industrial lubricant mixed with regret. The storage bay fell silent except for the steady hum of properly functioning containment fields and the distant vibration of the station's rotation. James realized he was facing a choice that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the kind of trust that couldn't be calculated or measured. Either Princess Lyralii was exactly what she appeared to be, a brilliant scientist trapped in diplomatic circumstances beyond her control, or she was the most sophisticated intelligence operative in the galaxy, playing a game so complex that preventing antimatter explosions was merely an opening move. Well, he said finally, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast, here's to cosmic radiation and industrial lubricant. If we're going to be framed for interspecies terrorism, we might as well enjoy the terrible coffee while we wait for the inevitable interrogation. Lyralii clinked her cup against his with the solemn ceremony of two people acknowledging they'd probably made a terrible mistake but were committed to seeing where it led. To terrible coffee and beautiful quantum mechanics. May our friendship survive longer than the peace treaty it's apparently threatening. The maintenance tunnel beneath the Concordia's quantum core resembled the intestinal tract of some massive mechanical organism, all twisting conduits and pulsing energy feeds that hummed with barely contained power. James crawled through the access shaft with the grim determination of someone who discovered that saving 3,000 lives required fitting through spaces designed for maintenance robots, not humans carrying improvised quantum field generators. I'm beginning to suspect, he called back to Lyralii, who was following him with her own collection of salvaged components, that whoever designed these tunnels never considered the possibility that actual people might need to use them. Zephyrian engineering philosophy assumes that if maintenance is required, the system was poorly designed to begin with, Lyralii replied, her voice muffled by the confines of the tunnel. We tend to build things that either work perfectly forever or explode dramatically when they fail. Your human approach of fixable but uncomfortable is refreshingly pragmatic. The station shuddered around them, a deep metallic groan that suggested structural integrity was becoming more of a suggestion than a guarantee. According to James's calculations, they had perhaps 15 minutes before the sabotaged quantum core reached critical cascade failure and transformed the Concordia into an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of deadline that made career decisions seem remarkably trivial. The irony, Lyralii continued, apparently unfazed by their impending atomization, is that the extremists who planted these charges actually solved several complex engineering problems while trying to kill us. Their sabotage technique is genuinely innovative. James paused in his crawling to stare back at her. Are you professionally impressed by the people trying to murder us? The quantum resonance dampeners they installed are actually quite elegant. They've created a feedback loop that amplifies natural core fluctuations until they exceed containment parameters. It's diabolical but mathematically beautiful. Lyralii's ears twitched with what James was learning to recognize as academic appreciation. I'm considering publishing a paper on the technique, assuming we survive long enough to reach a journal submission deadline. They emerged into the core maintenance chamber, a spherical room dominated by the massive quantum containment field that powered the station. The core itself resembled a miniature star caught in a cage of magnetic force lines, its brilliant white light pulsing with an increasingly erratic rhythm that suggested it was very much not behaving according to specifications. There, Lyralii pointed to a series of innocuous-looking devices attached to the containment field generators. The resonance dampeners. Whoever installed them had intimate knowledge of both human and Zephyrian quantum engineering. This level of technical sophistication suggests. Inside job, James finished, connecting the quantum field stabilizer he'd cobbled together from spare parts and determination. Someone with access to both technical databases and station security protocols. The core's pulsing accelerated, and James's improvised instruments registered the kind of energy readings that typically preceded very expensive explosions. He activated the stabilizer, watching as its crude but functional magnetic field began wrestling with the saboteur's elegant sabotage. The result was a quantum mechanics equivalent of arm wrestling, with the fate of 3,000 people depending on whether his practical engineering could overcome their theoretical brilliance. James, Lyralii said quietly, her attention focused on her own instruments, I'm detecting something else. These dampeners aren't just causing cascade failure, they're transmitting data. What kind of data? Everything. Station schematics, diplomatic communications, technical specifications, personnel files. Lyralii's expression shifted from academic interest to genuine alarm. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as terrorism. James felt the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his head with the satisfying click of a properly aligned mechanism. So the attacks weren't random terrorism. Someone's been systematically targeting cooperative research projects while simultaneously collecting intelligence on both human and Zephyrian technologies. And using the fear generated by the attacks to justify increased security measures that conveniently limited contact between our species, Lyralii added. Very efficient. Create the problem, then profit from the solution while preventing anyone from working together long enough to uncover the deception. The core's containment field flickered, and James's stabilizer registered a power fluctuation that suggested they were approximately 30 seconds away from becoming part of local space folklore. He activated the manual override protocols, routing power through backup systems that had probably never been tested under these conditions. You know, he said, making rapid adjustments to the field harmonics while sweat dripped onto his instruments, for a conspiracy designed to prevent human-Zephyrian cooperation, this plan seems to require an awful lot of human-Zephyrian cooperation to execute. Exactly what we should have realized weeks ago, Lyralii replied, her own equipment now synchronized with his in a desperate attempt to restore core stability. The only people with access to both technical databases would be joint project personnel. People like us. The stabilizer engaged with a harmonic resonance that made James's teeth ache, but the core's dangerous fluctuations began to settle into something approaching normal parameters. The immediate threat of atomization receded, replaced by the longer-term problem of explaining to their respective governments why they'd violated direct orders to solve a crisis that exposed high-level infiltration by parties unknown. I suppose, James said, checking the stabilization readings while trying not to think about the court-martial proceedings that awaited him, this means our friendship has officially been upgraded from diplomatic liability to evidence of treason. Possibly, Lyralii agreed, though her tone suggested she found this prospect more amusing than alarming. Though I suspect that successfully preventing the destruction of a major diplomatic installation might earn us some consideration for reduced sentences. The core maintenance chamber's communication system activated, filling the space with the voice of Commander Chen. All personnel, this is the bridge. The quantum core has stabilized and immediate danger has passed. Security teams have apprehended several individuals attempting to evacuate the station in unauthorized vessels. Report your status immediately. James activated the comm system with hands that were only slightly trembling from residual adrenaline. This is Engineer Morrison in core maintenance. The sabotage devices have been neutralized and the containment field is stable. Princess Lyralii provided essential technical assistance. Acknowledged, Engineer Morrison. Both of you report to the security briefing room immediately. There are some people very interested in speaking with you. The journey back through the station's corridors revealed the aftermath of what James was beginning to think of as the most politely executed crisis in interstellar history. Emergency teams moved with efficient calm, security personnel maintained their posts with professional alertness, and the general atmosphere suggested that everyone was rather proud of having successfully avoided being vaporized. In the security briefing room, they found Commander Chen, Ambassador Thaloran, and several individuals in the kind of nondescript uniforms that suggested either intelligence services or very serious janitorial staff. The assembled officials wore expressions that managed to combine relief, suspicion, and bureaucratic exhaustion in roughly equal measures. The preliminary investigation, Chen announced without preamble, has revealed that the sabotage was orchestrated by a joint cell of human and Zephyrian extremists who have been operating for several months. Their goal was to restart active hostilities between our species while profiting from stolen military technologies. Ambassador Thaloran, a tall Zephyrian whose elongated ears somehow managed to convey diplomatic disapproval, stepped forward. Princess Lyralii, your unauthorized actions have placed you in a diplomatically untenable position. However, your technical expertise appears to have prevented a catastrophic loss of life. And Engineer Morrison, Chen added, your violation of direct orders regarding contact with diplomatic personnel technically constitutes insubordination. However, your engineering competence appears to have saved the station. James exchanged a glance with Lyralii, recognizing the peculiar bureaucratic dance that occurred when officials needed to simultaneously punish and reward the same actions. So we're heroes who are also criminals. You're individuals whose personal friendship exposed a sophisticated intelligence operation while violating several important regulations, Chen corrected. It's administratively complicated. Lyralii cleared her throat with the delicate precision of someone preparing to commit diplomatic heresy. Commander, Ambassador, with respect, I believe we may be approaching this situation from the wrong perspective. The extremists succeeded because they exploited our mutual suspicion and isolation. They used our fear of cooperation to prevent the very collaboration that ultimately defeated them. The princess raises an interesting point, Thaloran admitted reluctantly. The investigation has revealed that the extremist cell relied on our respective governments maintaining strict separation protocols. Their planning assumed we would not share information or coordinate responses. James felt his engineering instincts engage, recognizing a systems problem that required a design solution rather than a regulatory one. So the real security vulnerability isn't human-Zephyrian cooperation. It's the lack of it. We're more vulnerable when we're isolated than when we're working together. The assembled officials exchanged the kind of meaningful glances that suggested important policy decisions were being made through facial expressions alone. James suspected that his friendship with Lyralii had just become either a diplomatic incident or a diplomatic precedent, though determining which would probably require several committee meetings and at least one formal inquiry. I believe, Chen said finally, that this situation will require extensive review and policy reconsideration. In the meantime, both of you will remain available for further questioning and technical consultation. As they left the briefing room, James realized that their friendship had somehow survived terrorist attacks, bureaucratic disapproval, and the threat of mutual atomization. It seemed unreasonably durable for something that had started with a shared appreciation for terrible coffee and quantum mechanics. You know, Lyralii said, as they walked back toward the observation lounge where this unlikely partnership had begun, I think our next collaboration should involve something less likely to result in court-martial proceedings. Any suggestions? I've been considering the station's coffee production systems. The molecular structure of the synthetic blend could be optimized using Zephyrian food assembly techniques. We might actually be able to create something that tastes like coffee instead of industrial lubricant mixed with regret. James considered this proposal with the seriousness it deserved. Improving station coffee could revolutionize human-Zephyrian relations more effectively than any diplomatic treaty. Exactly. And if anyone objects to our collaboration, we can point out that we're working on essential morale infrastructure. They entered the observation lounge to find it no longer empty. Small groups of humans and Zephyrians sat at tables throughout the space, their conversations animated and their body language suggesting that the species barrier had become considerably more permeable. James spotted Dr. Harrison, the astrophysicist who had perfected the human shuffle, engaged in what appeared to be an enthusiastic discussion with a Zephyrian engineer about stellar formation theory. "It seems," Lyralii observed, settling into her usual chair with satisfaction, "that preventing mutual annihilation has had some positive social effects." James took his customary seat beside her, noting that no one seemed particularly concerned about their proximity anymore. Crisis has a way of clarifying priorities. Hard to maintain species prejudice when everyone almost got vaporized together. Though I suspect the improved coffee will be the real diplomatic breakthrough. Nothing builds lasting friendships quite like shared suffering over terrible beverages. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the nebula's shifting patterns through the transparent dome while the station hummed around them with the quiet efficiency of a properly functioning interstellar community. James reflected that he'd learned something important about friendship during their brief but eventful collaboration. It wasn't the dramatic gestures that mattered, but the simple act of choosing to sit beside someone when everyone else walked away. "One question," he said finally. "When you mentioned that single-hearted species are considered tragically romantic in Zephyrian literature, was that actually true, or were you making fun of Commander Chen's concerns about inappropriate relationships?" Lyralii's ears twitched with unmistakable mischief. "Engineer Morrison, I would never fabricate comparative biology for comedic effect. Though I may have neglected to mention that Zephyrian literature also considers four-hearted species to be hopelessly dramatic and prone to overcomplicated emotional responses. So basically, everyone's romantically tragic according to someone's literature." "Exactly. It's very democratic." James raised his coffee cup in a mock toast, appreciating both the terrible flavor and the unlikely friendship it had helped create. To tragic romance, quantum mechanics, and the diplomatic power of improved beverage technology. To sitting beside someone when the universe seems determined to keep you apart, Lyralii replied, clinking her cup against his with the gentle precision of someone who had learned that the most important acts of rebellion were often the quietest ones. The hydroponics bay hummed with the gentle efficiency of 1,000 growing things, its artificial sunlight casting everything in the warm amber glow of a perpetual afternoon. James had suggested meeting here after discovering that Princess Lyralii possessed an inexplicable fondness for earth tomatoes, though her method of eating them, sliced into perfect geometric patterns and consumed with the precision of a mathematical proof, suggested her appreciation was more theoretical than culinary. "Your agricultural technology is fascinatingly primitive," Lyralii observed, examining a cherry tomato with the intensity of someone decoding ancient hieroglyphs. "You're essentially recreating planetary conditions in miniature, complete with soil microorganisms and pollinating insects. Zephyrian food production relies on direct molecular assembly. We program the quantum structure of nutrients and assemble them from base materials." James plucked a ripe tomato from the vine, biting into it with the casual irreverence of someone who'd never questioned the miracle of photosynthesis. "And how does that taste?" "Perfectly nutritious and completely flavorless. We eliminated the variables that might cause inconsistency, which apparently included anything resembling actual taste." Lyralii arranged her tomato slices in a spiral pattern that somehow managed to be both aesthetically pleasing and mathematically precise. "It's very efficient and utterly depressing." The bay's main entrance chimed, admitting Commander Sarah Chen, the station's human administrator, whose expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Chen had the particular grimness of someone whose job required her to smile at people she'd prefer to eject from the nearest airlock, a diplomatic skill that James deeply appreciated from a safe distance. "Engineer Morrison, Princess Lyralii." Chen's greeting carried the warmth of liquid nitrogen. "I trust your collaboration on the antimatter containment issue was successful." "The containment field is stable," James confirmed, wondering if Chen's tone implied she'd been hoping for a small explosion to simplify her administrative duties. The princess's theoretical expertise prevented what could have been a significant incident. "How fortunate." Chen's smile could have flash-frozen coffee. Princess, I've received a communication from Ambassador Thaloran requesting your immediate presence in the diplomatic section. Apparently there are urgent matters requiring your attention. Lyraliai's ears flattened slightly, a gesture James was learning meant either deep concentration or impending doom. What manner of urgent matters? The ambassador didn't elaborate, though I believe it concerns recent developments in interspecies relations. Chen's diplomatic training prevented her from saying anything more specific, but her expression suggested the developments were approximately as positive as a quantum torpedo malfunction. James watched the exchange with growing unease. In the 3 weeks since their first meeting, he'd observed enough station politics to recognize when someone was being maneuvered into an uncomfortable position. The careful neutrality in Chen's voice, the vague references to urgent matters, and the way both women avoided making direct eye contact suggested this conversation was actually a very polite form of bureaucratic warfare. I should mention, Chen continued with the relentless pleasantness of someone delivering bad news, that there have been questions raised about the appropriateness of informal contact between diplomatic personnel and station technical staff. Nothing official, of course, but concerns have been expressed about maintaining proper protocols. Lyraliai's mathematical precision with the tomato slices became more pronounced, each cut executed with the kind of focus usually reserved for defusing explosive devices. And these concerns originate from which particular source? Multiple sources, actually. Both human and Zephyrian officials have suggested that maintaining clear boundaries between our respective personnel might help avoid misunderstandings. James felt his engineering instincts activate, the same pattern recognition that helped him diagnose malfunctioning systems. Let me guess. These concerns coincidentally emerged after our collaboration on the antimatter containment issue became known to the senior staff. Chen's smile became even more arctic. The timing is perhaps unfortunate, but the concerns are legitimate. The current political climate requires extra sensitivity to potential complications. Complications, Lyraliai repeated, setting down her knife with deliberate care. An interesting euphemism for a human and a Zephyrian working together successfully. I can see how that might be deeply troubling to people invested in maintaining mutual suspicion. The hydroponics Bayes atmospheric recycling system chose that moment to engage, filling the silence with a mechanical wheeze that sounded remarkably like the station clearing its throat. James found himself caught between admiration for Lyraliai's diplomatic directness and concern for what appeared to be a coordinated effort to isolate her from any human contact. "Commander," he said carefully, "I'm curious about the protocol that prohibits engineering staff from consulting with diplomatic personnel on technical matters. Is that a new regulation?" Chen's expression suggested she'd prefer to activate the emergency bulkheads rather than continue this conversation. The regulation concerns informal social contact, not necessary technical consultation. And who determines the difference between technical consultation and social contact? Lyraliai's tone maintained perfect diplomatic neutrality while somehow conveying the impression that she was cataloging every word for future reference. Is discussing quantum mechanics over coffee classified as a security breach or a cultural exchange? The distinction depends on context and frequency, Chen replied, apparently deciding to embrace the bureaucratic labyrinth rather than find a way out of it. Regular informal meetings might be perceived as developing personal relationships that could compromise professional judgment. James considered pointing out that most of the station's important work happened through exactly the kind of informal collaboration that Chen was discouraging, but his survival instinct suggested that logic wasn't the primary factor in this conversation. Instead, he focused on the central problem with characteristic engineering directness. So the solution to improving interspecies relations is to prevent members of different species from actually relating to each other, he said. That's either brilliantly counterintuitive or completely insane. It's practical, Chen corrected. The peace treaty requires careful management of symbolic gestures and public perceptions. Personal friendships between high-profile individuals from both species could be misinterpreted as political alliances or romantic entanglements. Lyraliai nearly choked on her tomato slice. Romantic entanglements? Commander, I think you may have been reading too many human entertainment programs. The biological incompatibilities alone would make such a relationship highly improbable, leaving aside the rather significant issue of our species having different numbers of hearts. 2 hearts. James asked, momentarily distracted from the political implications. 4, actually. Though only 2 are strictly necessary for survival, the others handle enhanced circulation during periods of intense mental activity. Lyralii seemed pleased to shift the conversation toward comparative anatomy. Zephyrian physiology evolved to support extended periods of deep concentration, which requires increased neural blood flow. Your single-heart system would be completely inadequate for our cognitive demands. 4 hearts, James mused. That explains why you can process quantum equations while drinking coffee that would put most humans into cardiac arrest. Exactly. Though I should mention that Zephyrian literature considers single-hearted species to be tragically romantic figures, doomed to love with insufficient cardiovascular resources. Lyralii's expression suggested she was enjoying the absurdity of the conversation. Very poetic, very impractical. Commander Chen watched this exchange with the expression of someone whose carefully planned diplomatic intervention had somehow devolved into a comparative biology discussion. The point remains that maintaining appropriate professional distance would be advisable given current circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by the station's communication system crackling to life with an emergency announcement. Attention all personnel. We have received reports of an attack on the research vessel Harmony in the Vega system. All diplomatic staff report to emergency stations. Security condition yellow is now in effect. The hydroponics bay fell silent except for the continued humming of growth lights and circulation pumps. Chen's expression shifted from bureaucratic determination to genuine concern, while Lyralii's ears flattened completely against her head, a reaction that James was learning meant very bad news indeed. The Harmony, Lyralii said quietly, was carrying the joint research team working on quantum communication protocols. If someone targeted that ship specifically, they weren't just attacking random installations, James finished. They were eliminating the people working on technologies that would make long-range communication between our species more efficient. Chen was already activating her personal communicator, her diplomatic training taking over as she shifted into crisis management mode. Princess, you'll need to report to Ambassador Thaloran immediately. The security briefing will require your input on potential Zephyrian involvement. And Engineer Morrison will need to return to technical duties, Lyralii added, understanding the implications. I suspect our informal consultations have just become a luxury neither of our governments can afford. James found himself facing the peculiar disappointment of having his friendship terminated by interstellar terrorism. So the people attacking cooperation between our species have successfully prevented us from cooperating. Temporarily, Lyralii corrected, carefully wrapping her remaining tomato slices in a napkin with the precision of someone preserving something valuable. Though I suspect our next collaboration will require rather more careful planning and significantly better coffee.